Hello class. This week I want to share with you the process of drawing from a grid. This technique is used to enlarge an image. And so for this exercise you're going to need a printout of your image. I have this beluga whale, but I'm asking that you all pick an image of an interesting piece of architecture. And so those of you that don't have access to a printer or want to do the alternative assignment should watch my video covering the GIMP software, because when working from a grid you can either do it by hand if you have a printout, or you can do it digitally. So here I'm going to cover working with a printout and doing it by hand. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to need to actually draw on your printout, setting up your grid. And for your grid you're going to want to set up square units, because basically we're going to cover this image in squares, and then we're going to set up a square grid with the same number of squares on the drawing paper, but the squares will be larger. And so that's how we are going to use the grid to help us with proportions. So for the first thing, you're going to have to set up a grid. And so for this image, I'm going to do 2" by 2" squares on my grid, just because this is a demo. And depending on how complicated your image is, you're going to want to have more squares or less squares, and just watch the video to see why that is. So first I'm just going to roughly divide the image in half. And for this portion of working from a grid, you can draw hard lines, but when you do your grid on the actual drawing paper, you're going to want to use very light pressure, so just keep that in mind. So now that it's set up, I can mark off 2" units, so that way I can give myself 2" squares. And you need to use a ruler for this. Okay. And in order to get your lines straight, you can line up your ruler with the edges of your image or the edge of the paper. I'm lining up the edge of the ruler with the edge of my image, so that way the line is straight. Okay. And here I can line up the ruler with the edge of the paper. Okay. And then let's just mark out, finishing out these other boxes. So depending on the dimensions of your image, you will have more or less boxes. Okay. So right now the majority of my images on these 8 boxes, and so that's your first step, is to grid up your image with square boxes. The next step is you're going to create a grid on your actual drawing paper and you should do the same number of squares. And the function of this process is to enlarge an image, so make sure that the squares you're drawing on the drawing paper are larger than the squares that grid your reference image. So for the squares on my drawing paper, I'm going to do 4-inch squares. And so I'll start by roughly getting the grid in. And now you want to use very light pressure to do these lines because they'll all need to be erased out, and so if you press too hard you won't be able to erase them out. So that's one 4-inch unit, another 4-inch unit, and then let's do one more, because it looks like my image is 3 rows or 3 columns. 3 rows. Okay, so the next you can mark out 4 inches here, 4 inches here. Okay, and then we'll get a line, light pressure, four inches, 4 inches. Okay. And I'm lining up my ruler with the edge of the page so that way my grid is 90 degrees. Rulers are pretty cheap, so if you don't have a ruler, get a ruler. And okay. Let's do this. So, almost done. So I advise that you do square units because it's a lot easier to keep track of the proportions when you know they're squares. Okay, and now I just need to extend these boxes just a little bit more. My image. Okay, so now I have enough boxes to put my beluga whale into my drawing, and with the proportion of the boxes it should enlarge this image by 2. So the way working from a grid works is instead of having to look at the entire image to figure out your proportions and eyeball and measure and look at negative space, you can now have more divisions, more moments to measure against and check your proportions against. So you have to decide where your squares orient though. So for this, I'm going to decide that this square is this one. And then that means we'll use these 3 or 4. Actually, let's make it this one. So, because we have 4 squares, let's use these 4. So, that means that this square corresponds to this. And so if I'm going to get the outline of my beluga, I can actually check where on the reference, on the grid, it's hitting visually against the grid. So it looks like just a little bit from the top is here. And so I'm going to try to render eyeballing where the proportions of the whale are against the grid. And it may be useful to break up your squares into even smaller units. So here, because the printout doesn't extend all the way into the square, it's going to be useful for me to actually divide it. So I'm going to measure 1 inches to break up this square. And when I work from a grid, I usually end up doing this on faces, which I'm doing here. And just make sure that the unit you break it up into is square. Okay, so now that square is broken up into 4, so I'm going to do the same thing to my drawing grid. So I'm going to mark 2 inches, and then lightly break up this box into 4. And now I can check this square against this, and I can look at the negative space, and what this shows me is that I missed that a bit of the lip is coming up here. It's this. And remember to use very light lines, because you never want to commit too quickly to lines in your drawing before it's worked out. Oops, this is a dirty eraser. I'm just running it alongside a plastic container to clean it off a little bit. Okay. So now I'm checking this negative space shape. Looks like my proportions are actually more like this for the mouth. This comes out. So that's this. So next I can come down, and you're going to want to erase mistake lines as you go so you can keep track of what's accurate. And so then now we're at this square. And so I can continue the mouth. I'm going to look at the negative space shape. It looks like the crease of the mouth hits a little bit lower than half and pretty close to this line. So I have to make sure that my drawing communicates that proportion. And then the lip, it's about here, it makes a triangular shape there. Continue this. The mouth hits at about halfway down the square. Just make sure that is communicated. Okay. Next I can place the eye. Not exactly at center, it's a little bit to the right and a little bit south of the center of the square, so that looks about right. And then at the center of this square, the mouth comes in not quite to the center. It's about there. And then look at the triangular shape the mouth makes here. At about the midpoint, that's when you start seeing this jaw come down. There's a negative space shape here. So the grid allows me to make more minute decisions about the proportions and measuring. Look, the body just appears in a tiny rounded triangle there. And so it just helps you set up more accurate proportions quicker. Okay. Bottom of the body comes to about here. There's the fin. Comes to a little past the halfway point here, creating this negative space shaped triangle. Fin, the top of the fin's below the halfway point, creates this triangular moment here. So those proportions are correct. And then let's look at the negative space here. Head slips up a bit. Looking at the negative space shaped triangle there. And then let's see how much of the body takes up this square. So you want to use this process for very specific forms, specific subjects, such as celebrity faces, animals, architecture. You don't want to do it for things that are amorphous, like clouds, or lack of detail, like a jellyfish. So that's my line work of the beluga. I'm pretty confident in it. Because I worked from the grid. And so for you all, after you've transferred your lines to the drawing using the grid, I want you to spend the rest of the 2 hours shading. And when you're shading this, I want you to erase out and remove the grid lines. And then draw a new border around the drawing inside the page. Alright, so that's working from a grid. Make sure you do it in graphite and make sure that you start with light pressure.